Today is our great pleasure to have Professor Colin Sparks here to give us a talk. So Professor Sparks is Emeritus Chair Professor of Media Studies at Hong Kong Baptist University. Before joining HKBU, he worked for many years in School of Communication at the University of Westminster, where he directed the Communication and Media Research Institute. His research interests include media in societies experiencing rapid social, economic, and political change, comparative media systems, and the impacts of new media upon legacy media. And his most recently published work, undertaken in collaboration with Chinese scholars, has been about the impact of digital technologies on mainland Chinese newspapers and journalism. I know previously you asked a lot of questions about how to theorize your work, because I think you pose a lot of questions, how to move beyond the descriptive level. So today it would be such a terrific opportunity for you to get to know more about this. So I will just give the floor to Professor Sparks. So let's give a big hand to Professor Sparks. Yeah.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's morning here, a cold morning, but very bright and sunny. I think that I'm speaking to first-year PhD students. If there are second or third years who heard this last year, the talk hasn't changed a great deal. This is really aimed at people who are beginning their PhDs. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is theory. We all know that scholars need to use theory in their research. It's a commonplace. If you send an article to a scholarly journal, for example, the editor will almost certainly say, we need theory-driven manuscripts. It doesn't matter how fascinating your facts are, the evidence, empirical evidence doesn't make an article. You need to have theory. At least that happens to me all the time. Editors invariably say, interesting facts, how about some theory? In fact, it's not an essential aspect of the production of knowledge. If you look at the university's regulations for the PhD degree, they read, this is paragraph 15(1)(b), the thesis shall form an original contribution to knowledge. That's the key thing in a PhD, an original contribution to knowledge in the given discipline. The originality will be shown either by the discovery of new facts or theories, or by the demonstration of innovative critical thinking. So it's not new facts and theories, it's new facts or theories, or innovative critical thinking. Obviously, in many of the social sciences, you can discover new facts and possibly develop new theories, or at least advanced theories. In many areas of the humanities, you're not likely to discover new facts about, say, William Shakespeare or whatever. Most of what there is to be known about him has been known for a couple of hundred years, but you can demonstrate innovative critical thinking. So it's a range, making a contribution to knowledge has a relatively wide range of meanings, but particularly, I think, in media and communication studies, the question of theory is absolutely central. Not all scholars are theory-driven. I don't think I am. I think I'm much more fact data-driven or evidence-driven, I suppose I'd say. But that's not a good thing. When you go for your interview and you describe your theory, your job interview, you describe your work, you should describe yourself as being theory-driven, because that sounds much better. Actually, I think it's a false dichotomy that theory and data exist in a relationship to each other, and that no one begins a research project without a theoretical framework, and nobody concludes at least an empirical project without engaging with data. The question really is, how self-conscious are people about the theories they are using? So overall, what we want to talk about is what a theory might be, and how it relates to a given research project. There are a very, very wide range of theories, a bewildering range of theories. And you and I need to make choices between those theories when we come to build a research project. I'm not going to tell you what theory is correct, which theory to use. I'm not making any judgments on the theories that I'm going to talk about. I really want to talk more about the main choices that a scholar needs to make, what you need to think about when deciding which theory is going to be appropriate to your research project. I am afraid that I shall rely almost entirely on Western scholars, Western theories. I would be very interested in the discussion section if anyone will point to the ways in which the Western bias of the field and of me is limiting, and how there are alternative theories or alternative ways of thinking about theory outside of the Western scholarship. But I can't live outside of who I am and what my background is, so I'm afraid I'm relying on the Western theories. So anyone who wants to put up their hand and say, you know, Professor Sparks, or Colin as I prefer to be called, that's all very well talking about that in the UK or the USA, but here in China we have a different conception, or here in India we have a different conception. So what is a theory? Well, Dennis McQuail, who's very, very, well, he's now, he died quite recently, but he authored a very influential mass communication theory textbook, which went through many, many editions and sold thousands and thousands of copies, and I assume made him quite a rich man. He gave a very flexible definition. A theory should be understood not only as a system of law-like propositions, but as a set of ideas which can help us make sense of a phenomenon, guide action, or predict a consequence. And this is a very, very broad concept of theory. There are alternative definitions. This is Lowry and DeFleur, two US scholars. They also wrote a very influential conceptual history of the field, textbook for theory, if you like. They gave a much more restricted definition. Their definition: theories focused on well-defined aspects of the process or effects of mass communication stimulate the research process to move forward on what is often referred to as a cutting edge. Focused theories identify problems with known boundaries and set forth reasonably clear propositions that can be tested against well-defined data. This is a much, much more, I suppose one could say, rigorous definition of what theory might be. Negatively, one might say a much more exclusionary theory definition of what theory might be. I think that Lowry and DeFleur are working within a social science tradition, which they see as being an offspring of the natural sciences, whereas McQuail sees that approach, a system of law-like propositions, which is one way of putting that, and other forms of intellectual inquiry, humanities, for example, a set of ideas. So we already begin to see a tension, which I think is one of the key themes in this talk, is between people who believe themselves to be the inheritors of the natural sciences and people who believe themselves to be the inheritors of the humanities. In HKBU, both of those processes are utilized. In the School of Communication, both of those approaches are utilized. And I want to begin by emphasizing that diversity is a central characteristic of theories in our field. There are lots of theories, and that's not something which is to do with people being confused, it's to do with the nature of the field. Two US scholars writing in the Journal of Communication identified 26 major theories only within mass communication studies, leaving outside other areas of studies of the media. in 26 major theories which have been used, which have been published. I think they said have been published in the Journal of Communication and one or two other leading journals, Journalism, Mass Communication, Quarterly, blah blah. They did content analysis of 50 years of these journals' theoretical, and they found 26. That was before 2000. I haven't been able to find a more recent similar attempt to count the number of theories, but I think that the engagement of the field with digital phenomena would mean that there were now rather more than 26. There are one or two interesting articles, particularly by a famous scholar called Elihu Katz, who has been around for almost as long as I've been alive, who said that some of the major theories that Bryant and Murren, for example, identified no longer apply. And clearly there are new theories which are specifically tailored to digital theories. So this is the most recent one I can find, the most recent peer-reviewed article that I can find. And I think many of these theories, as you'll see when we look at some of them, remain influential today. So first of all, we're dealing with many theories, a plurality of theories. I would say a bewildering variety. We work in a field, not a discipline. A discipline, maybe chemistry is a discipline, maybe physics is a discipline, but we work in a field, something much wider than that. Our interests, our theories and methods are very wide. We look at different aspects of media and communication: internet, film, journalism, health communication, organizational communication, and so on and so forth. A vast range of things. We're not just interested in one thing. We have different conceptions of the media. Some people focus on the characteristics of the media itself, media-centric, for example. Recording has started again. For example, in the many years ago when I taught film, there was something called screen theory, which was associated with the 1970s and early 80s of a British film magazine called Screen, which was very heavily influenced by semiotics. It was a school of thought, which was quite different, for example, from the political economy approach or the Frankfurt School or whatever. And there are different kinds of theories. There are theories called critical theories, theories called administrative theories, scientific theories, normative theories, etc., etc., etc. The range is enormous. And there are different levels at which theory can be pitched. There's grand theory. Let's say Marxism is, I suppose, the best known grand theory, versus theories of the middle range, and I'll talk more about what they might be later. And of course, there are different methodologies. There are experiments, people do surveys, they interrogate historical documents, they engage in participant observation, they engage in textual analysis, and so on and so forth. The variety is so great, and sitting probably in front of computers and listening to me are people who occupy various different parts of this. And I think that we have to start by saying there are no grounds for claiming that this particular theory is the correct theory which everyone should use. Don't want to be exclusive about theory. Bryant and Murren, as I said, identified 26 major theories, and this is in their period of origin. You can see that the most recent one they identified was media dependency theory back in 1976. I hope there are going to be a few more modern theories than that in more recent things. And the oldest they identified was Marxism, originating back in 1844. Why they chose 1844, I'm not entirely clear, but they did. So a very, very large number of theories, 26 of them, with some of them very, very well known: agenda setting, uses and gratifications, Piagetian theory, which much less familiar, I expect, to most people. It's about educational development, 19 theories. Symbolic interactionism, surprisingly only 12. psychoanalytic theory, only 10. Cultivation theory, 56. A very wide range of different kinds of things people had used to publish articles in the top scholarly journals. We can make, I think, a division, a basic differentiation within these theories. Where do we fit inside the overall scheme of knowledge? We can say, well, we're obviously not a STEM subject. We're not STEM, we're not science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Although we might use bits of each of them, that's not the core of what we do. If you take a purely descriptive view of what happens in the School of Communication, there are a combination of two domains. Communication studies, which is mostly social science inspired. Media and film studies is mostly humanities inspired. So there are these two, I think, emphases within the school. This may correspond in terms of the field as a whole to a geographical divide. The USA is dominated by the mass communication and social science approach. Europe much more by a film and media studies and a humanistic approach, humanities approach. I think one can overstate that, but that's if you go to the ICA, it's dominated by mass communication and social science approach. If you go to IMCR, which is much more European in its orientation, it's much more dominated by the humanities. If you go to big film studies conferences, they are overwhelmingly humanities dominated. As I say, both of these traditions are represented in HKBU. I guess most of, or indeed all of the communication studies work is social science inspired, and there may be a bit of humanities stuff around the edges, but I think, at least in my memory, most of the people working in the field of working in the Department of Communication Studies are social scientists. I think that's true of most people in journalism. There are one or two people who are not, but I think the bulk of people are social science inspired. And I think most and probably all of the Academy of Film is humanities inspired. So these distinctions are present inside the school. Some people fit uncomfortably in the middle. They're not social scientists and they're not humanities people. Me, for example, social scientists would say, oh, he's not a social scientist, he's a humanities researcher. And the humanities researcher say, oh, he's not a humanities researcher, he's a social scientist. Maybe it's just that I'm not very good at either of them and fall in the middle somewhere. But what I always say is when I'm talking to people in the tradition of cultural studies, which is where my PhD was, I'm a social scientist, I'm not one of them. And when I'm talking to social scientists, well, I'm a humanities scholar, really. So, so perhaps I just use this as a way of avoiding commitment. But perhaps the opposition is not very useful. Perhaps it isn't really a way of thinking about theory. But people certainly think it's important. People have, there's a lot at stake for people in how they identify this. I want to talk a little bit about what's the problem with simply seeing things as science, social science. There is a rhetoric associated with science. In English, at least, it has a lot of rhetorical power. Differently, for example, in German, Wissenschaft doesn't quite mean the same thing as science tends to mean in English. I don't know what what weight this category is given in Chinese, I'm afraid. Perhaps someone can enlighten me. So science, at least, gives us an access to the truth in a way that, say, semiotic interpretations don't, or at least commonly believe not to. Science involves particular kinds of research activities, and it seeks to eliminate subjective elements from the process of research. So natural sciences do not imply any particular ethical judgment about ends. So, you know, the orbit of the moon is not a good thing or a bad thing. That's just how it is. That's the way the moon moves around the Earth. And we can explain why that's the case. We can analyze problems with it. We can do all sorts of things, but we can't make a moral or ethical judgment. We can't say the moon is a good thing, its orbit is a bad orbit, or whatever. It just is. The idea of social sciences borrows some of that authority. Science, after all, has been enormously successful. You know, if you look at and enormously influential, if you look at any university that I can think of, with the sole exception of the London School of Economics, I think, which doesn't have any scientists, every university I've ever come across is its vice chancellor, and the key people who run it are scientists. So it's got a huge institutional authority and I think popular authority. If you look at advertisements for toothpaste, you know, they'll have someone dressed up in a white coat as a scientist talking about its efficacy. So social science tries, if you like, to align itself with the natural sciences. And it claims that some of the things that people do emulate those of the natural sciences, particularly they attempt to remove the subjective dimension. To take a very, very trivial example, if you conduct a content analysis, a quantitative content analysis, it's obligatory to have a measure of reliability, usually Cronbach's alpha, which is a measure of the ways in which other trained researchers produce the same results as you do. They make the same judgments that you do. So the judgments you're making are not yours and then not theirs. They are judgments which are shared. They're not subjective judgments. And indeed, the terms sociology, psychology are etymologically about sciences. That's what, you know, that's what they mean, the science of society, the science of mind. So this is a very powerfully developed notion that the social sciences are in some ways or other the close relatives of the natural sciences. And they claim to share ethical protocols for the conduct of research. When you come to develop your research project, you will have to make an ethical statement. The university has an ethics, well, the faculty has an ethics committee. The university has ethics committees, has an ethics committee, and you have to satisfy the basic ethical requirements. But it's difficult with the social sciences to be indifferent to the ethics of ends. You can talk about the ethics of the methodology. You can talk about, for example, guaranteeing anonymity, you can have consent for using children as respondents or whatever. But the ethics of ends, I think, is always present in an inquiry into society. I don't think human relations can be treated in the same way as natural phenomena. I don't think that, I can take an example of social stratification. Is it ever really treated as an ethically neutral state subject? People who investigate social stratification, they can think it's ethically a good thing or ethically a bad thing, but I think it's unavoidable. It's not like the orbit of the moon. I think it's something which is inevitably bound up with human ends, with the ethics of human ends. But there is a question about how far any of the claims of natural science can be sustained. One classic discussion of this is a distinction raised by a US philosopher of science, man called Thomas Kuhn, who made in a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He made a distinction between two kinds of scientific work. He said there was normal science and there was revolutionary science. He said it in 1962, so that's quite a long time ago. I think the basic idea, however, has been often, his formulations have often been criticized in detail, and it is rather dated, but I think its basic idea is still very influential. As I say here, at least on my generation. You know, this is what I read as an undergraduate. So it's you know, what you read as an undergraduate tends to mark you quite strongly. He was interested in the history of physics, and you know, what constituted, talking about Western physics. He was interested in how it changed, how it advanced, what its dynamics were. And he said physicists work within paradigms. That's to say, they have overall ideas about what the nature of physics is. And the paradigm sets the rules about what you're looking at, what counts as theory, what counts as evidence, etc. He says every scientist works within a paradigm. And he said most of the time, physicists work to develop one particular paradigm. And they tend to ignore or marginalize evidence that doesn't fit. The classic example of this is the attempt to apply Newtonian physics to the motions of bodies in the solar system. The Newtonian paradigm described most of the motions of heavenly bodies, of the planets, for example, very, very well. But there were some things, particularly with the orbit of Mercury, that it didn't explain. So scientists tried to find evidence that explained it. They posited the fact that there was another very small planet, Vulcan they called it, moving inside the orbit of Mercury, which caused these problems with the variations in the perihelion of the orbit of Mercury, were to do with the existence of this. That's what theory said. Theory said there must be a little planet there. And they looked for it. And on two distinct and separate occasions, they found it. Now, we don't today, I don't, but physicists who know much more about these things than I do today don't accept that. They say this was a false observation. But it's an example of how the theory pointed people in one direction. The paradigm said this must exist, and therefore people found it. So they didn't believe that there could be something which didn't fit this observation. And of course, as is very, very commonly recorded these days, sometimes it's not possible to reproduce the evidence that leads to important conclusions. The reproducibility, and this is particularly a problem in the human sciences, reproducibility levels are very, very low. So some of the ideas that we're actually resting on perhaps, you know, the evidence that was used to support them can't be reproduced. So work within the paradigm he called normal science. And most scientists, most of the time, work very productively like this. Yes, Newtonian physics was the dominant paradigm for what, 200 years? And you know, very, very many scientific advances were made during that period. And you know, Newtonian physics is still, I suppose, used for many engineering projects, for example. I think there's an obvious sociology that fits this philosophy, that scientists don't work in vacuums. They're not, certainly these days, they are not independent inquirers. They work inside large bureaucratic organizations with hierarchies. The leader of the organization The dean of the school has a certain view of what normal science is, or what apparently the dominant paradigm of science is, and he or she recruits people who fit that paradigm. I think that's fairly obvious sociological reality. Against this, Kuhn proposed revolutionary science. He said sometimes scientists break with one paradigm and try to establish another. And he said they do this independently of the available evidence. His great example was the breakdown of the geocentric, the Earth-centric theory of the universe, and its replacement by the heliocentric theory of the solar system. And he argued that the reason for this was not that there was the empirical evidence was faulty, but that there was a theoretical problem, that people rejected Copernicus rejected the theory, and he called this revolutionary science. Examples of revolutionary scientists include Copernicus, who ended the, well, no, it didn't end actually, but he proposed the alternative to the geocentric theory of the universe, and Einstein, who proposed a theory which ended the sole domination of the Newtonian paradigm. And a successful revolution led to a paradigm shift. If in the end, Copernicus's theory replaced that of Ptolemy, in the end, Einstein's theory, at least for some purposes, replaced that of Newton's. There was a paradigm shift. Of course, in the natural sciences, these things are relatively rare, but we don't expect the underlying theory of the universe to change every 5 minutes. They're relatively rare changes, but nevertheless, they are important in terms of their fundamental shifts. I think it's important to remember that a scientific revolution doesn't imply any other sort of revolution. So this is about the philosophy of science, not about society, not about society in general anyway. Copernicus, after all, was a priest. Einstein, it's true, was a leftist, but not an active. wasn't primarily concerned with changing society. These are not revolutionary science. Is not in any other sense related to the concept of revolution. There's a big unanswered question as to why there are paradigm shifts. Kuhn says specifically it's not for empirical reasons. It's not because the evidence doesn't fit. It's perhaps there's a long accumulation of contrary evidence. And why are some paradigms accepted and not others? For example, the shift from Ptolemy to from the geocentric to the heliocentric theory of the solar system was not uninterrupted. In between, there was another paradigm by a Danish physicist called Tycho Brahe, which in the end wasn't accepted. Apparently, it explained the empirical evidence rather well, but it was, according to Kuhn, it was not beautiful. If you like, for aesthetic reasons, it involved unnecessary complications. Neither normal nor revolutionary science is incorrect, is wrong. Revolutionary science sometimes establishes the framework within which normal science is conducted. If it's successful, then, as for example, the development of the theory of relativity was successful, then scientists normally work within that framework. And normal science advances knowledge, even if only within that paradigm. And paradigms are not necessarily true or false. They all are capable of telling us something about the nature of the physical world, but they don't grant access to incontestable truth. They aren't absolute truths. Absolute incontestable truth is for theology, not for science of any kind. So even with the physical sciences, I think there's a need to be very conscious of exactly what claims can be made and how they can be contested and so forth. The social sciences are not natural sciences. They borrow from natural sciences, but they're not natural sciences. In particular, there's no agreed and accepted paradigms. There isn't a general agreement on how you think about things. In the list we looked at, for example, social interactionism, functionalism, and Marxism, etc., are different paradigms. There are different ways of thinking about the nature of social inquiry. And they, as paradigms do, identify different kinds of problems. So, for example, functionalism, associated with primarily with American theorist called Talcott Parsons, asks how social phenomena are able to reproduce existing social relations. In other words, it's about how the organization of society tends to reproduce itself. Marxism, on the other hand, has a different conception. It wants to show how social phenomena embody the contradictions present and therefore lead to a tendency to disrupt social relations. A completely different way of thinking about society. So there isn't a single paradigm which is accepted by everybody. If you look at contemporary writing on let's say on the area that I know about, on journalism, or know something about on journalism, one of the most influential international theories is that developed by Daniel Hallam and Paolo Mancini, who explicitly developed their theory of the nature of newspapers and journalism in general, but newspapers in particular, with regard to theories of functionalism, Marxism present in many, many different forms. And because there is no agreed and accepted paradigm, there can't be a single normal science. There can be normal science within a given paradigm, but social scientists need to be aware of the paradigm within which they're working. And in my view, they ought to be able to articulate that paradigm and why they're working within. So I suppose my bottom line is not which theory do you follow or do you adopt, but can you articulate what that theory is, what the paradigm underlying it is, and why you're using it. It seems to me that reflexivity is a central is the central core of things. And I'd say also that if natural sciences are partial, provisional, contestable, and supersedable, social sciences certainly are partial, provisional, contestable, and supersedable. Another one of the major divisions amongst theories is between critical and administrative research, and this is one which is very specific to media and communication studies, at least in its origins. It's a distinction advanced by a man called Larsfeld, who was born in Austria, but spent most of his career in the USA. And he drew this distinction even further, longer ago than Thomas Kuhn, back in 1941, even before I was born. And he was actually one of the key founding figures of mass communication research. Larsfeld is one of the if you like, I suppose now a grandfather of the field. And he himself was definitely in the field of administrative research. He wasn't as narrow as many people who use his ideas, and many people in mass communication research are not as narrow as that. He collaborated, for example, with Theodor Adorno, who was one of the key figures in the Frankfurt School. They collaborated when they were both in exile in the USA. Larsfeld from Austria, Adorno from Germany. In the early 1940s, they were working together on a radio research project in Columbia University. And Larsfeld's theoretical position, at least, was that there should be a collaboration between both critical and administrative research. Critical, again, I want to be careful, does not necessarily suppose any particular normative or political stance. As it happens, Adorno was I suppose, a leftist. And very often critical does mean leftist, but there are important exceptions. Max Weber, one of the founders of social sciences, Daniel Lerner, one of the names who, if you talk about development communication, you'll undoubtedly come across, Marshall McLuhan, who everybody has heard of, were certainly not leftists. So you can be a critical scholar, but it doesn't mean you have to run around denouncing capitalism. Critical is not the same as leftist in the normal Chinese usage. Chinese usage of leftist has a distinct characteristic which is not necessarily recognized everywhere in the world. In fact, arguably the opposite, but that's an argument which is not appropriate to have here. What then is administrative research? This is Larsfeld's characterization. Behind the idea of such research is the notion that the modern media of communication are tools handled by people or agencies for given purposes. The purpose may be to sell goods, or to raise the intellectual standards of the population, or to secure an understanding of government policies, but in all cases, to someone who uses the media for something, it is the task of research to make the tool better known, and thus to facilitate its use. Research of the kind described so far could be called as administrative research. It is carried out in the service of some kind of agency of a public or private character. An example would be a project which looked at how most effectively you can advertise cosmetics. That would be an administrative project on communication. What is the most effective form of advertising for L'Oreal or Estee Lauder or whoever? How can it work better? How can we use it better? Critical research, on the other hand, he argued, was the idea of critical research is posed against the practice of administrative research, requiring that prior and in addition to whatever special purpose is to be served, the general role of our media of communication in the present social system should be studied. The idea of critical research seems to be distinguished from administrative research in two respects. It develops a theory of the prevailing social trends of our time, general trends which yet require consideration in any concrete research project, and it seems to imply ideas of basic human values, according to which all actual and desired effects should be appraised. So an example of that would be a project designed to determine how the images used in advertising cosmetics help to reproduce a particular kind of femininity. So, for example, in many East and South Asian countries, cosmetics are designed to lighten the skin. What particular kind of femininity does the use of light-skinned images produce? What kind of image of femininity does that produce? According to Larsfeld, the two should work together. And now for the specific contribution to which the idea of critical research can make to the student who is engaged in the administrative research side of the problem. One way to put it is to point to the strong intellectual stimulation which derives from such joint efforts. This is him and Adorno. There'll hardly be a student of empirical research who does not sometimes feel a certain regret or impatience about the vast distance between problems of sampling and probable errors on the one hand, and the significant social problems of our time on the other. So he's arguing that, you know, a healthy research project, if you like, and the happy researcher combines the two. However, in practice, they fell out badly. Larsfeld went one way and Adorno went another, and they gave rise to different traditions of investigation. Larsfeld, really one of the founders of the dominant US tradition that I spoke about earlier, and Adorno, one of the founders of the dominant European tradition that I spoke about. Larsfeld spent his whole career in the USA, even though he could have gone back to Austria after 1945. Adorno went back to Germany as soon really as after the defeat of the Nazis. It was safe for him to go back. And geographically and intellectually, I think they followed different paths. You might say they had a paradigm clash. You know? There's the paradigm of administrative research, which aims to show how a particular problem works within a given set of social relations, and critical research, which tries to show what the limits and the ways in which a particular kind of communication might be changed in order to change society. A third major division is between different levels of theory. There are different kinds of theories. Critical and administrative research tend to have different conceptions of what theories should address. In our example, the administrative version theorizes the effects of different kinds of media messages. This kind of advertisement for cosmetics produces that result. This kind of advertisement for cosmetics produces a different kind of result. In other words, the theorizing the effects of different kinds of messages. A critical version would theorize the overall patriarchal construction of femininity, and say that this is production of cosmetics designed to produce a particular kind of woman within a particular, or image of femininity within a particular male-dominated society, and so forth. And they therefore tend to have different conceptions of what they're studying. Administrative theories tend to be media-centric theories. We're going to talk about how this advertising message works. Critical theories tend to be sociocentric theories. They say, how does this particular kind of message fit within an overall set of social relations? And therefore, they tend to operate at different levels of generality. Administrative theory tends to address a discrete and bounded phenomenon, and critical theory attempts to locate a phenomenon within a broader theory of society. So if you like, administrative theory is closer to the definition of tends. I mean, and all of these things I'm saying tends, because we can always find exceptions to them. They tend to be working within the way of thinking about science that we saw with Lowry and de Fleur at the beginning. And critical research tends to be working within the much more general, flexible, loose, if you like, approach adopted by McQuail. That the question of what kind of level of theory you're talking about, however, if you're talking about trying to explain the relationship between a particular kind of advertising message and a general construction of femininity, you're talking about a very high level of theory. What Robert K. Merton, a key founder of US sociology and man who recently has had something of a revival, I suppose. He was a student of Talcott Parsons. He came out of the functionalist school. Talcott Parsons is the great theorist of functionalism. And he said three different kinds of theories. He said grand theories discuss the overall workings of society. functionalism and Marxism in the examples we took are in the paper we looked at are examples of this. They talk about how society as a whole works. They're grand theories. He called theories of the middle range ones which seek to explain discrete social phenomena across a range of situations. They're not just to do with this or that. They're to do with generating a theory which fits a range of phenomena. And examples he gave, we would take from Bienen's work, is agenda setting. Agenda setting is a theory used with regard to political communication. It's regards to medical consultations, with regards to the construction of educational programs and so forth. Yes, it's something which can be used across a wide range of situations. He didn't have a category of little theories. What he said was there are working hypotheses that are common sense procedures. I think in our framework, two-step flow would be an example of that. Maybe it's middle theory of the middle range. That's arguable. Merton himself favoured theories of the middle range. He said the grand theories too big. Little theories, working hypotheses, common sense procedures don't advance our overall understanding. Only theories in the middle range, at the moment at least, are worth following. Although, to me at least, much of his work looks like a grand functionalist theory. Although he's a critic of Parsons and specifically criticising grand theories like Parsons, it seems to me that a lot of what he wrote fits grand functionalist theory. But anyway, how do all these things fit together? Working hypotheses and common sense procedures will fit either grand or middle range theories. We all need working hypotheses. We all need common sense procedures, whether we're grand theorists or middle range theorists, whether we're talking about the construction of femininity in patriarchal society, or we're talking about how agenda setting works in political communication. We need these. But how do you fit the other two together? For grand theories, the problem is always how you test it. Okay, this is fine. And the classic critique of grand theories from this point of view is that they don't put forward testable propositions. They're very abstract indeed and have little immediate purchase on social phenomena. So they need to be broken down into propositions that for which one can gather evidence. You can't test a grand theory like Marxism or functionalism. You have to talk about particular aspects of it. An example would be Edward Said's famous use of Foucault's general theories to illuminate the phenomenon of Orientalism. Talk specifically about how discursive practices were used by Europeans to construct, in his case, the societies of the Middle East as different, other, and Oriental. Problem with theories in the middle range is not that they're not testable, they usually are, but how do they fit together? Merton argued, well, okay, they don't, but it's too soon to expect that to happen. Over time, we'll come to see how they fit together. And the problem with this is that 50 years later, it's hard to see any evidence of such a synthesis, that how these things fit together is not really made any progress, that they're still distinct theories. I would argue, and this is my view, all middle range theories imply a grand theory. One example from B&M would be learners' modernization theory. Learners' modernization theory is the theory of how, it's the classic theory of how the media can contribute to social change. And it says distinctly what the media have to do is promote images of modernity in order to convince peasants to move from traditional to a modern way of thinking about the world. That's one of the classic theories of development communication. And it depends, it's a middle range theory, but it really depends on a grand theory. It depends on a Weberian sociology. The notion that social change is fundamentally a product of ways of thinking about the world. A grand theory that Weber most famously developed in the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Lerner actually self-consciously, explicitly places himself within that tradition of grand sociological theory. So this is a middle range theory which fits very well within grand theory. If we're going to research, we have to make choices between these alternatives. Both notions of paradigm formation and grand theory address issues of coherence. They say, what is to be investigated? How is it to be investigated? Normal science and middle range theories are dependent, I argue, on paradigms and grand theories. So to choose a middle range theory is to choose a grand theory. And to conduct normal science is to accept a paradigm. But, these seem to me to be inescapable. In the natural sciences, it's very problematic as to whether there can be more than one concurrent paradigm or grand theory. In the social sciences, certainly there are several. At any one time today, there are different paradigms of how society functions. And so social sciences, as I've argued, have unavoidable ethical dimensions. And they're more than simply the kinds of ethical questions that you get asked in the ethics submission for your thesis. And social science projects are social knowledge of society that implies, doesn't necessarily directly imply it, but it certainly always implies social action. And therefore, to choose a paradigm or grand theory is to prioritize certain kinds of social knowledge and social action. And social theories are therefore, in my view, necessarily normative theories. Normative theories, it's possible to distinguish between three different ways of talking about things. You can make a descriptive statement. This is the case. This is what someone said to me. This is what the results of the questionnaire are. This is how the experiment worked, or whatever. You can make analytic statements. This is the case because of that. These responses are due to a particular social condition. And normative statements are that this should be the case. Most scholarly work in the social sciences and the humanities aspires to analytic status. It wants to be explained why things happen. And it usually also contains descriptive statements. It actually has evidence, data. And it usually aspires to avoid normative statements. Some forms of social research are explicitly normative. Not all social research aims to avoid normative statements. Action research is self-consciously, it's to do with participating in activity that you think is normatively worthwhile and building a research project through that. Less explicitly, much of journalism studies claims that journalism should be the public interest, about the public interest, public sphere. I've just read the proof of a book by quite well-known Chinese scholar, works in the West, called Tong Jin Rong, about digital journalism. And this is, she's quite explicit that journalism is about the public sphere. It is about informing the public and so forth. but many other people are not quite as explicit. But much discussion about journalism assumes that it should be about the public interest, about the public sphere, and not. People talk about Fox News and the New York Times. They don't talk about Vogue and other consumer magazines. Most, in other words, are unconsciously normative. They perhaps depend on unstated and perhaps unconscious normative paradigms. So we have to, if we make a choice of any level of theory, we're also making a choice about grand theories, about the world as a whole and the way human action operates in that world, and we're also making a normative choice, consciously or unconsciously, about what it is to be done. I think that very often there is an elision between theoretical frameworks and methodological approaches, and I don't think that methods should determine the nature of inquiry. I don't think I think very often they do, but I don't think that they should determine the nature of inquiry. Methods should be determined by the need to answer a research question, that you decide on your research question and then you decide on the method of how you're going to answer it. And sometimes you can't answer questions because of the available research methods. So, for example, many inquiries into organizational communication will tend to rely on responses from lower members of the organization, because it's Rupert Murdoch isn't going to give you an interview. You can't. It's very difficult to conduct the same kind of inquiry at the level of chief executive officers. Simply, you can't answer questions about that because the research methods aren't available. A distinction I think it's very important to hang on to, and it's much debated used to be much debated in Baptist University. Quantitative is not the same as empirical. An example I would give is historians, someone talking about, I don't know, the construction of the European in the Shanghai cinema of the 1930s. They will look at archives, they'll watch movies, they'll read memoirs and so forth. That's entirely empirical work. They are getting empirical data. But that's just as much as people who are conducting an experiment in a laboratory are getting empirical data. The material that historians gather will often not be quantitative, it will often be qualitative evidence, but it's empirical evidence. The experiment in the laboratory will almost certainly produce quantitative evidence, which is empirical as well. So quantitative and empirical are not the same thing. Someone says, I'm an empirical researcher. Well, actually, almost everyone. There are some people who engage in pure theory. Very famous English sociologists, whose name escapes me now, he's so famous. I would probably never did any empirical sociological research, but most people gather empirical material, and all of this evidence, even the hardest of hard data, is an artifact of the research instrument. You construct a research instrument which gives you the data. The data doesn't present itself unasked, if you like. And I don't think there's any theoretical link. I think there are many practical examples, but I don't think there's any theoretical link between a particular methodological approach and a theoretical position. I don't think that a particular theory implies a particular method. Both critical and administrative research can use both quantitative and qualitative methods. An example of a critical researcher who uses quantitative methods, one of the most famous critical theories of the role of the media in Western societies is associated with Chomsky and Herman and Chomsky. Chomsky's specific anarchist theory is a very critical scholar, but if you read their books on media and communication, they also wrote, Chomsky is most famous as a linguist, but he wrote books on the media, and they use overwhelmingly quantitative methods. They use overwhelmingly content analysis. So you can be a critical researcher and use quantitative methods, and you can be an administrative researcher and you can use qualitative methods. Both normal and revolutionary science address the evidence. Neither of them are purely speculation. There are, however, I think, patterns of inquiry. Administrative researchers administrative, normal, and quantitative research tend to have media-centric theories of the middle range, and critical or self-described revolutionary qualitative research employ theories of sociocentric grand theories. I think these tend to be the patterns, not exclusive. The dominant US tradition tends to be administrative, predominantly administrative. It tends to restrict itself to theories of the middle range. It addresses discrete problems in theoretical isolation. It assumes the natural status of the current social and media order, and it employs quantitative methods. That's the dominant US tradition. We can find plenty of other traditions inside the US, but that's I think, as I say, go to the ICA, that's what you'll find in the center of the business. And the dominant European tradition, predominantly critical, it tends to seek to elaborate grand theories. It seeks to understand problems in their overall social context, and it sees the current media and social order as a historical construct, and it tends to employ qualitative methods. As I say, go to the IMCR, and that's, or at least it was, I think it's changing actually. It was the dominant tradition. I don't think the basis for these is people have different theories of knowledge. I don't think it's a epistemological difference. It's probably sociological, to do with how the relationship between the university system and various funding agencies has developed. And like I say, there are plenty of examples to show these are only tendencies. Chomsky is an American who is critical, who has a grand theory of the media, which he seeks to explain its overall context, but he employs quantitative methods. So there are plenty of examples. So at last, after a very long time, some tentative conclusions. I think that theory is an unavoidable element of social investigation. It's not that that you have to have it, or you don't have to have it. It's that it's unavoidable. You just simply can't avoid having theory. Even the most data-driven researcher, and as I say, I'm really a data-driven researcher, but I'm not the most data-driven researcher, is complicit in theoretical issues. There's no single accepted theory for investigating communication and media. Amongst the people who are your potential supervisors, there are a wide range of different theoretical positions, of varieties of almost all of the areas that I've talked about today. Even if you don't agree with what I've been saying today, there's still such a wide field that you can't. I cannot see how you can have a single theory which combines the study of the semiotics of cinema with the investigation of organizational communication. They're so broad, you're going to need different things. There may be a grand theory that holds them all together, but in practice, these are equally worthy investigations. I don't think any are obviously better than the other. The question you have to ask of any theory is really not, is it good or bad, but what knowledge does it deliver? What can we find out using this theory? I think that the arguments for administrative research and normal science are not primarily intellectual. I think that in both the social sciences and the humanities, researchers work in hierarchical communities that need to be funded. And I think, to be honest, that in both the natural sciences and the social sciences, normal science is easier to fund than revolutionary science. And administrative research, I think, in general, is easier to fund than critical research. Consciously or unconsciously, however, all research rests on a grand theory, on a paradigm, on a way of thinking generally about the issues. And therefore, all researchers must make choices, which theory, which paradigm, which method, and so forth. And the grounds that make those choices are not reducible to research protocols. Those follow from the theory, not make it. I think the interests of reflexivity, it'd be good to acknowledge that we do make such choices. I suppose my main point today is not you should believe, I'm certainly not making the point you should follow this or that theory, that you should be a grand theorist or an administrative researcher or conduct normal science or whatever. I'm not saying you ought to do one or the other of these, but I do think that people ought to be able to say why they've chosen this particular topic, what the implications of their theoretical framework is. They need to be self-reflexive, if you like. Okay, I think that's all that I have to say today. So I'm happy to answer questions, accept critiques, or whatever, really.
Okay, thank you so much, Colin. It's really a wonderful talk. I enjoyed a lot. So now let's open the floor. It's really a great opportunity for you to ask Professor Sparks. Yeah, so yeah, if you can raise the hand and then we can start.